In this video, we're going to look at identifying gaps in the literature. When you write a literature review, one of your main goals is to understand what current research is saying and where more research can be done. When you identify gaps in the literature, you're identifying ways that your study can add value. There's a few different types or categories of gaps that you can look for. The first is the identification gap. There's the old problem of which came first, the chicken or the egg. This happens a lot in research. Causal claim exists, but design is weak or contested. It's a problem of, did A really cause B? It happens when previous research shows a correlation between two things, but the causal link is shaky. There might be omitted variable bias, where something else is causing both, or simultaneous causality, where B causes A. For example, a study says education increases income, but critics argue it's just because high-ability people get more education. If the previous study didn't account for innate ability, then there is an identification gap. In the context of our example, people report greater symptom improvement when expectations are measured, but it is unclear whether asking about expectations causes stronger placebo effects. So a way you could fill this gap is to design a study that randomly assigns participants to expectation question versus no question before placebo treatment and compares symptom outcomes. There's external validity gaps. This is where an effect is known in one setting or population, but it's unknown elsewhere. So if there's a study saying that a certain treatment worked for a small village in Kenya, it might not apply to a large city in Brazil, or a policy that worked in the 1990s might not work in 2026. With the placebo effect, if its effects are amplified by expectation questions in lab pain tasks, it may differ from effects in routine clinical visits where expectations are formed informally. So you can run the same design in lab tasks and real clinical style encounters and compare effect sizes and response patterns. There's also a measurement gap where there's just kind of a bad data problem. And it happens when a concept is noisy and inaccurate, or endogenous, meaning it's influenced by the system itself. So an example of this would be a researcher using number of patents to measure a country's innovation. You could argue that this is a measurement gap because many innovations are never patented, making the data a noisy proxy for true creativity. In our case, placebo effects are often based only on self-reported symptoms, which may reflect reporting rather than real change. The way to fill this gap would be to combine self-reports with objective or behavioral measures and examine where they diverge. You'll commonly find mechanism gaps. This is when an effect is documented, but a channel is unclear, so it's kind of like this black box problem. We know that X leads to Y, but we don't know why it's happening because this channel or pathway is missing right here. So we know that having more parks in a neighborhood reduces crime, but is it because people are outside watching each other and their eyes are on the street? Or is it because parks lower stress levels? If the literature hasn't tested these paths, then there's a mechanism gap. We know what's happening and we might even be able to establish causality, but it's more the question of how. Asking about expectations may increase placebo effects by strengthening belief, increasing attention to symptoms, or encouraging favorable reporting. You can combat this by measuring belief strength, attention, and perceived pressure, and testing which factor explains the effect. So taking a closer look at that black box and trying to figure out what's going on inside. The equilibrium and welfare gap is when a study might show a policy helps one group, so there's partial equilibrium, but it ignores how the rest of the economy reacts. It also might ignore whether people are actually better off, which is the welfare gap. So if studies aren't sufficiently accounting for externalities or minority subgroups, increasing the minimum wage helps workers who keep their jobs, but if it causes prices to rise for everyone or it leads to automation, then the total effect on society or the welfare is unclear. In our example, expectation elicitation may improve short-term symptoms, but lead patients to overestimate treatment effectiveness and delay seeking effective care. So a valuable study to fill this gap would be one that tracks symptoms, beliefs, and treatment choices over multiple periods, and tests whether short-run gains are offset by later misallocation or delayed care. And the last half of this study description leads into our final category, the time horizon gap. Sort of a double-edged sword because it's pretty easy to identify but very difficult to fill. This is when short-run effects are documented but the long run is unclear. Economics especially is famous for things that look good now but could hurt tomorrow. Like a tax cut might boost consumer spending this year in the short run, but if it leads to massive national debt that crashes the economy in 10 years in the long run, then there's a gap in the literature if no one has studied that long-term horizon. For example, placebo effects triggered by expectation questions may fade after repeated use or strengthen through repeated belief enforcement. So if you design a study that measures outcomes and expectations immediately, short-term and long-term after repeated placebo exposure, that would be a great way to fill this gap. So in your own research question example, see if you can identify some gaps in the literature. Is there an identification gap, where there's many studies validating correlation without causation? An external validity gap, where really only one population is included in these types of studies? A measurement gap, where the key variable is noisy or endogenous? A mechanism gap, where we know an effect is happening but we're not really sure how? The equilibrium and welfare gap, have people looked at how this benefits or disadvantages society as a whole? Or the time horizon gap, looking at what these effects look like long term.